Welcome to Facing the Moment, brought to you by the Foundation for Self-Leadership. In these episodes, we will address various crises and focus on how to navigate them with abundant fortitude and a bit of hope. As we discuss relevant observations together, we will identify meaningful actions that will generate valuable insights. You can download all episodes on Apple Music, Spotify, and YouTube.
I welcome our listeners to this episode on healing community trauma. And let me start by acknowledging that whole communities today within the US and elsewhere feel a sense of dizzying imbalance. They're looking for something to hold on to. They're in pain. Some feel indignation, fear, anguish. And for some who may have felt similar experiences for generations, the pain is not new, but certainly today compounded. To help unpack all that and discuss a way out of the suffering and toward healing not only within each of us, but in the spaces between us and for all of us together as communities, I'm very pleased to be joined today by Aizaiah Yong, PhD. Aizaiah, very good to see you. Welcome.
Hey, Tawfiq, thank you so much for the warm welcome. I'm really happy to be with you today.
Thank you. Aizaiah is a scholar, academic dean, member of a teaching faculty, minister and theologian, and author of an upcoming book that I found inspiring and highly insightful on trauma and renewal. Aizaiah was a member of the 2022 cohort of IFS Leadership Fellows, which the foundation was honored to have sponsored. In this book and work on building communities, Dr. Yong shares his own journey from surviving a life-altering accident to building liberative and inclusive communities. And he talks with hope about the possible path from pain and isolation to community transformation. Welcome again, Aizaiah. I'm wondering if there is something else you'd like to add about you, about your journey, which would be relevant to our conversation today.
Yeah, thank you so much again. For me, the journey to healing and transformation is lifelong, and it's not something that we can embark on by ourselves. And so this book and part of my heart in the work of tending to trauma is about how we can come together, honoring our differences, learning from the experiences of one another to support one another in the intensity of life as it continues to unfold for each of us in the many ways it does. And so for me, healing is a relational activity, and we need each other. We belong to each other in that. And so with all that said, I just want to honor my grandparents come from an immigrant family who modeled such incredible courage to come to the United States in the ways they did, with very little resources, very little network of support, but to believe for healing in their own lives, healing for the world, their communities, and also have charted paths both spiritually, materially, in every way for me. And so I just want to honor kind of their witness and the ways that their stories, continue to be lived on as part of my own. And so I'm grateful for them as well.
Thank you for that. It's critical for all of us to remember, the generational legacy that we carry. Our ancestors do live through us. And if we stop honoring that, I think there'll be something missing in our lives and our contributions to society. So let's start talking a bit about individual trauma and healing. Trauma, be it lowercase t or uppercase t, happens unexpectedly and sometimes mercilessly through life's twists and turns. And it is often the source of pain, at times seemingly unbearable and insurmountable. Could you start perhaps by explaining to us what individual trauma is?
Sure. So trauma, as I understand it and work with it, is really, any event that happens to an individual that completely overwhelms the person's response or ability to cope or to process what happened. And it could be it often is perceived as a life-threatening experience or event that happens firsthand to a person, or it could be something that happens vicariously or secondary through witnessing someone you care about or someone you don't know almost nearly lose their life as well. And so when something like that happens, when it becomes trauma is when it completely overwhelms or stifles our ability to process it, to be attentive to it, and to find a way through it. And so it leaves us stumbling. It leaves us undone in our own lives as individuals, without much of a sense of how to move forward, how to carry on. And so it's very, very, very challenging, leads to many difficult places. And it comes in all kinds of shapes and sizes, and everyone's experience with it is unique based on their own histories, their own lived experiences, their own perceptions, their own personalities. No two trauma stories are the same.
And clearly here we're talking certainly beyond the physical. We're talking about emotional. We're talking about even moral injury. We're talking perhaps about spiritual. So could you say a bit about that before you share your own story that I'd love the listeners to hear about?
Absolutely, right. And so trauma can absolutely be physical. Obviously, someone could be in a very life-threatening physical situation, but it could be life-threatening psychologically, where a person is experiencing, different forms of abuse. People talk about adverse childhood experiences that have a intense effect on people who survive through that, and what that does to a person's life. And so absolutely, it can be psychologically, physically. You mentioned spiritually. Some of the spiritual communities that we may come from, cultural communities that we may come from, may have imposed a certain way of being or doing things onto us in our lives that was threatening to us if we were to kind of resist or choose something different. And so in that sense, it can very much happen to an individual in all kinds of communities and spaces. Something I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more later on is the collective trauma, which are also experiences that don't just happen to individuals, but can actually happen to groups of people, whether through living an event or can be passed down, intergenerationally as well. So there's all kinds of those types.
So I'd like to go personal, if you don't mind. In your book, you described a tragic event, traumatic event that happened to you more than 6 years ago now. And you called it the moment that changed everything. And somehow you found a way through it and a way out. So I'd love for you to share with us, to the extent you're comfortable and you can, that example of that event, and then we can figure out how to unpack it together.
Sure. So in 2018, I was a PhD candidate. I had just defended my oral examinations as part of my program, and I was actually on my way home to celebrate a successful oral defense exam in my doctoral studies. And on my way home, coming on the freeway, I was blindsided by a Ford F-150 pickup truck, large vehicle, and I was on a motorcycle. And I was hit off my bike, and I went down into the freeway, multiple feet at a fast speed. And thankfully, somehow I had enough gear to protect kind of my mind, my brain, and my upper body, but I didn't quite have the right gear for my lower body, especially for my legs. And so in that experience, I had a very severe injury to my right leg. And when it all happened, of course, it happened in a blink of an eye. You don't even expect it. You don't know what happened. You're kind of in shock. And I was so grateful in that time. I kind of came to an awareness a bit that I was on the middle of the freeway, feeling very vulnerable, of course, and helpless, because you can hear cars going past, right? And you're wondering, is someone going to see me? Are they going to be able to avoid me? But I was able to have a few strangers unexpectedly, very bravely, came to my side. It was actually a recent immigrant couple from Egypt, a Muslim couple, who actually were the first ones to stop, to actually come to my side and tend to me, to even hold up my head in the position I was in. And then there was a Jewish man from Lebanon who was actually a motorcyclist, and he stopped as well. to be with me until the ambulance and others came. And if it wasn't for them, I mean, the Jewish person actually, he actually did a tourniquet on my leg. I don't know how he knew to do that. He wasn't a medical professional, but he actually was able to help kind of stop some of the bleeding, to provide some, the physical care, at least immediately. And I think it was about 15 or 20 minutes I was laying there, but obviously it felt like an eternity. And I was hospitalized then for the next 31 days. I underwent 8 surgeries and was unable to walk for the next 8 months. And so there was a series of reconstructions that had to happen to my leg. And of course, there was excruciating pain in the immediate aftermath of that. And I remember the first kind of, I don't know if I could even call it respite, but just moment where I wasn't just in total pain, like inability to cope, was like on day 8 after surgery number 5. It was a 16-hour procedure that was intended to be 8 hours, but they ran into some complications. And it was when I kind of began to awake from that I wasn't in just devastating pain. But of course, it's been a 6-year journey too then. I mean, I still wake up often and do have pain and difficulty walking around. I wear a brace. But it's been a journey. And so that was something that happened that really left me in a very intense place of suffering and challenge.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And you talk about it with such composure. I have to tell you, I read about it for the first time in the copy of the book you shared with me, and I was completely maybe I was traumatized vicariously because I've known you for 3 years now, and I did not know about this experience of yours. And now when you're retelling it, I mean, my heart stopped a couple times. So I'm curious to understand from you, besides the unimaginable physical pain and the challenges you went through medically, what was the most painful aspect of that experience, the way you look at it now, 6 years in?
I mean, the physical pain was definitely one of the most intense challenges. But I think in terms of emotionally and psychologically, we had just had our second child a few months prior. And, again, I was a doctoral student. I was working 2 couple jobs to be able to pay the bills for our family. I was, wanting to do our best, do my best for the family. And when all of a sudden your life gets turned upside down and you're completely unable to go to work, you're completely unable to provide for people who are depending on you to do so, it's quite a difficult experience to sit with that. And to feel like the person you love, your beloved, is now kind of alone, having to manage things with a newborn child, and you're not really able to do much in that situation. And so I write a little bit about that in the book, and how all the energy I had spent so much time kind of helping and contributing something positive to the world, I was now in this place where I didn't feel as though I could contribute anything positive. If anything, I was now more of a burden for my family and for those who loved me. And part of that, I think, comes from kind of internalized oppression, legacies of ableism and patriarchy that I had never really investigated in a deep way, but all that kind of bubbled up to the surface when I was laying in the hospital bed. And of course, my sisters, I'm the oldest child, my sisters coming to my side to help me bathe, to feed me, to just do what they could, to be present. I mean, it's quite a humbling experience when you're not accustomed to really, even looking for support in many ways. And so in that sense, going through that challenge was a very vulnerable experience, and something that was not pleasant in any way as it was happening. And yet there were so many people who were helpful. I just want to say there was one neighbor I'll never forget who came in from the apartment community we lived in, came and visited us in the hospital room, and just looked at me and said, "Hey, I completely understand that you're unable to be with your family. I want you to know if there's anything I can do for your partner, for your children. If there's anything at all, even something small that you need, like I would like to be able to do that for you. And it was just the sincerity of even just mentioning that, of course, I completely broke down to know that there were people who weren't even family, people I didn't know that well, who were there to support me through that in such a heavy time. That was very impactful, very transformative for me.
Well, it's certainly one of the unexpected gifts that you probably have received during this, physical healing and maybe even emotional healing process. Are there other unexpected gifts that come to mind during this journey over the last 6 years as you navigated the post-traumatic experience?
Yeah, I mean, there are different instances that come to mind that have completely, transformed my way of seeing in the world. For myself, I teach and I've studied kind of mysticism across different traditions, and that was something that I was interested in even before this all happened. And one of the things that many different mystics across traditions talk about it is kind of this path into communion with the sacred that often involves some kind of intense passion or suffering or absence or just, and it could be physical, emotional, spiritual, some kind of intense struggle as part of that journey. And of course, in my life, we all go through things that are difficult and challenging. I'd never been through anything like that. And in a certain way, it was almost as if I was having my own journey through some of those things firsthand that I'd read about, I'd heard about, I've witnessed maybe and others go through, but it was kind of a direct encounter with this other side of reality that becomes very difficult to talk about. And it's in a lot of spiritual spaces, for example, people tend to bypass them. They think of spirituality as that which makes you just happy or joyous or as comforting. And it may be some of those things, but there's also a side to our spirituality that is a fullness of experience that also includes, these other aspects that are very difficult and painful, and how to be with them in a new way. And so for me, I feel that experience drew me deeper into conversation. I think of St. John of the Cross, who talks about the dark night of the soul and, this inability to kind of connect to this ultimate reality as one understands it. You're completely in a new ballpark. Mm-hmm. And I felt as though this was kind of my own deepening into that. When it was happening, of course, you don't think of it that way. It's just you're trying to find a way out of it. You're trying to do something that'll work, but you realize all the questions and things you used to do that would be helpful. They don't work the same way anymore. Mm-hmm. And so whatever it means to walk through this, there's going to be a radical change that happens. Sure. And I think it's that sense of kind of a radical change, a new consciousness perhaps, that is a potential of if someone survives such an experience, because you never desire for it, we should do everything we can to prevent them. But if and when they happen to us in the ways that they do, when we have others to walk with us, whether it's the person I mentioned, the stranger that came, whether it's a writer who had lived a long time ago, who talked about his own experience of walking through something unimaginable, there become these companions for us. And for me, that's the difference. It's not our own willpower, our own, muster up strength. It's having others where we can look to the left or to the right and say, hey, I'm here with you. I'm here with you in this. It's not going to make it any easier. It's not going to make it any better, but I'm here with you in this. And it's that sense of companioning that, I could tell more stories, but was a kind of unfolding through this process of post-traumatic experience.
And I'd like to talk more about the relational and community aspect, which you wrote a lot about in your book. But before we go there, if you don't mind, just a couple of questions around spirituality. You mentioned it, I mentioned it, and it seems to have guided you on your difficult journey for trauma recovery, or as you called it in your book, Renewal. Might you tell our listeners what you mean, what is meant, let's say, by spirituality, and how different it is from organized religion, and maybe where it intersects with that, if it does?
Mm-hmm. Right. So But I think it was absolutely essential for me as my own spirituality, my personal spirituality. And it's a great question because it's a question that comes up a lot for people who have struggles with kind of institutional religion or a certain religion they were brought up in that doesn't feel aligned for them. And so thinking about a spiritual, usually when something like that happens, you kind of just get allergic to anything religious or spiritual, and rightfully so. I think that's actually important when it's not life-giving. But when I talk about, spirituality, I'm talking about this kind of personal, direct experience with the sacred reality. And when I say sacred reality, I'm not talking about a monotheistic being necessarily. I'm not talking about a certain doctrinal system. I'm talking about a kind of way in which each person can live out a sense of aliveness, a sense of purpose, a sense of moral good and agency, creativity that kind of animates, their own personhood. And so, some scholars talk about religion as having different dimensions, where you have maybe an institutional dimension of religion. So we talk about, the organizations and the budgets and the board of directors and all those things. And then that could be one leg of it. You have the intellectual dimension of religion, where you have kind of the ideas, the thoughts, the stories, the ways that gets passed and told. And then you have the spirituality of religion, which is really for each person to kind of get to know for themselves. No other person has the same as another. And so it's a kind of equal and open invitation for people to explore for themselves. And so I would like to say something like, you might have religion in some ways, but not have a living spirituality. But any living spirituality is probably in some way holistic, and it involves our total person. And so it does involve our religious stories. It involves our cultural stories. It involves our different identities. So a spirituality that's alive is kind of holistic. And so when I talk about spirituality being important, for me, it's a way of being fully present to my own life, including the intense suffering, right? Including the challenges I have to work through that, including the gifts I have to work through that. And so it's the spiritual life that brings all that together for me and allows me to do something, I would say generative, or at least in solidarity with the world. In Confucian spirituality, suffering is kind of a given, but our suffering is what actually connects us to others. It keeps us tenderhearted. It keeps us open. It keeps us in a place of interdependence with the world. And so, again, this isn't romanticizing or looking for it. You're not looking for it, but it's kind of the sense that it's going to happen. And when it happens, is it going to turn you towards the world in a greater sense of connection and compassion, or is it going to turn you away from it? And it could do either. There's no guarantees what it's going to do. And so that's why we need, I think, each other when we don't feel like it's bringing us closer into the world, to ask us new questions, to be present to us and listen to the anguish and the despair we might be in. And so in that sense, again, there's different spiritualities from different traditions that can give us insight into how we might be on a journey of ongoing healing and renewal. It's not a one-time thing that happens to us. It's a lifelong journey.
Yeah, you made that very clear. Yes. And you mentioned the connection with the others who are here, but some sort of, I don't want to call it metaphysical connection. It could be just an emotional connection with our ancestral legacy.
Yes.
And then there's the whole world of thoughts and beliefs and values and emotions that we also somehow ignore, that become an important part of that. Is that what you're saying? That you have to take that holistic view,
yes,
of all these elements, and that's what represents spirituality?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, the living spirituality is holistic, and it involves our material, our physical, our psychological, all of those pieces. And there may be another dimension to our spirituality that's beyond words. It's beyond a full description, but it's something we can experience, we can return to. And in some ways, it may be this kind of underlying resource that can help us to be present to our lives more honestly, with integrity, with more compassion. And so for me, spirituality includes, again, that holistic experience of each of us. And it also invites us to this other dimension that's, again, beyond any one or final articulation, but it's alive.
Yes. I mean, most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, have felt
Sure.
that there's something greater than us. There's something, kind of steady in us that we can be in touch with when the noise settles, if you wish, when the rebels of life get cleared up, that sort of thing. So let's move to the relational and communal healing. And you spoke a lot about that in your book, and you've done a lot of work building communities. So take us on this bridge, if you wish, between the individual and community. Right. I mean, given today's world, and we cannot ignore the fact that there are traumatic experiences we're all living right now.
Yes.
Both when it comes to nature, when it comes to political systems, when it comes to each other. And you said trauma doesn't just live in individuals, right? It triples through families, neighborhoods, entire communities. So give us a sense of what that means and put that in context for us.
Right. It's such a profound question. So, even in my own journey personally of walking through this, I never wanted to share this journey publicly, and I never intended to write a book about it. But I recognized that part of the healing I was longing for could only go so far by myself. It could only be as deep and as rich if the people I loved, who also were traumatized through this experience, were able and open to go on that journey, right? And it's a journey where we might all undergo it, but everybody has to kind of, through their own consent, through their own process, open themselves to a healing path. And so, like in my situation, for example, my mother was actually on the phone with me when I went down on the motorcycle. I was on Bluetooth headset, and I was telling her about the positive news about the exam. And if you can only imagine, for all the parents out there who love your children, hearing your child go down and, be in a life-threatening situation is a very traumatic experience to hear and to undergo. And it's very painful to know that she was on the other side of that, in her own way, experiencing the challenge. I am grateful that she was able to actually call for the help immediately, because she was on the phone. So she had enough somehow wherewithal to be able to hang up the phone. And she even says, the hardest choice in all of that was to hang up the phone with my son. I didn't want to hang up the phone because I didn't know if that was the last time I would talk with him. But I also knew that he needed help, and that I was the one in position to actually make that call. And so, she made the call, and that's what allowed some of the medical, professionals to come as soon as they were able. But when I was thinking about the healing journey, and we talk about some of it in the book, right? And so it's a recognition that trauma doesn't just happen to individuals. It happens to people who witness it, to people who love you, when people care for you or walk with you, or if they don't know you that well and they see you go through something happens to them, because we are relational beings. And so there's that side of the healing path, that if we want to transform and renew our experience when we go through these things, we need to support each other. And it's one thing to be aware of that, and it's another thing to learn skills and capacities of how we might be the kinds of people to support one another when that happens. And so this was an intense project, because it wasn't just me telling the story, this success story. It was really, in some ways, going back into some unresolved things, even in our family history, and how that was bringing to the surface through this event. And so, kudos to my parents, who I honor and I love, for being willing to engage in that kind of space, not just with me, that would be enough, but then to actually write some about it and to be able to share that with the world, especially kind of coming from an immigrant household where there was never resources or tools or spaces where we could really reflect on the kind of trauma of moving, forced relocation, the trauma of poverty, the trauma of, racism, these impacts that live in our bodies as a family, and now come to the surface when our life is threatened in this new way. And so some of the book is about how this moment wasn't just about my leg. It wasn't just about a physical experience, but there was a whole nother dynamic. And so when we talk about communal trauma, it's not enough to just work one by one, although one-on-one work is great. We have to find ways in our households, in our other kinds of communities, and in our life together, that we become more sensitive and compassionate to the experiences we walk through. So that's part of what we were wanting to raise in this book. And I told my parents, I said, of course, it's totally up to you what you say and how you say it. And I really hope that you all will stick with me through this process of writing it, because it wasn't for me just a book for me to write by myself. This was a book for us to reflect together, even if it's in an initial way, to provide a new way of being together that may open up some other possibilities in the world.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'd like us to stay on this level of communities that have been traumatized, whether through poverty, racism, oppression. There's enough examples, nearby and far away, today and over the years, over the decades and centuries of communities having been traumatized.
Yep.
What kind of practices and rituals have you seen could foster healing, whether rooted in faith, culture, creativity? And really, I'm curious of, we have a sense of what a traumatized community looks like. It's hard for us to imagine, and would love to imagine what community healing looks like. So if you can, share some thoughts around that.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a profound question, and it's something that I do think about a lot. And I think about how great there is a need for that, and how maybe perhaps the healing journey comes in unexpected ways. What I mean by that is, I think that the number one prerequisite for healing is a kind of openness and sincerity of oneself, where there's an openness to experiencing a kind of support, a kind of presence, a kind of who knows what, but something else beyond just the suffering, just the trauma. And I think in many ways, we all long for that, but sometimes it's really difficult to be open, because of course, when you're traumatized, the last thing that it feels like you have capacity to do, right, is to cope. It is to really be in a state of openness. I mean, that's what it does, right? Is you're surviving. And so I think what we need oftentimes when you talk about what does community healing look like is we need these stories, we need these examples, we need these rituals to be able to remind us that people have walked through really intense and immense challenges that offer us some insight. It's not necessarily a model to copy, but it's enough of a kind of energetic encouragement to allow us to try something. And, one example that I love to return to a lot is someone who's very important to me, Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman, who was one of the spiritual advisors to the civil rights movement. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, carried Thurman's book everywhere that he went in terms of the social, spiritual work that they were leading. And for Thurman, what he said as a Christian, as a Protestant Christian, he said, the spirituality of Jesus, he said, is different than people who are religious people who are connected to organized Christianity. He was very appalled by organized Christianity in the United States on all levels, mostly because he said, the church is one of the most segregated places where we still divide, we still separate ourselves from one another, when that's the opposite of Jesus' message, of what Jesus' spirituality was. So he really was very frustrated with organized Christianity, and he actually went to go see Gandhi in India to learn about the nonviolent struggle and transformation that was happening. And it was through learning from and with Gandhi and the other leaders there in India that he was actually reminded of Jesus's message in a new way. And that led him to write Jesus and the Disinherited, where he's famously quoted for saying that the spirituality of Jesus is more than just a doctrine, more than an idea, but he says it's a technique of survival for the oppressed. And so there's a whole lineage, at least for Thurman, in Jesus's life and ministry that understands oppression, understands trauma, understands collective suffering, and actually gives teaching and examples and ways of being in community together that can actually tend in a healing way. And so that's just one example, and we could look at other traditions and examples to explore that. But I think that's exactly the idea, that there are these stories that aren't often told in these ways that are the wisdom of humanity, that we can learn to heed from one another, to rediscover in some ways, and then be able to approach in a new sense. It's not just, though, the kind of spiritual giants that we might think of. The healing also looks like the ways in which we come together and we share and we care for one another and we show up for one another, even when we don't fully feel prepared or equipped to do so. And this was especially clear for me in my situation, like the story I told with the individual who came, who is probably thinking, what can I offer to this man who I barely know? Probably nothing, but I just want to show up and tell him, if there is something, I'm here for that. And so just making ourselves available to each other, even in our kind of sense of, I don't know what I can bring, but I'm here with you, that is a start. And then I'll say with that, it's also the ways in which we can be fully engaged with our own lives, to things that bring us to a sense of connectedness. You said, all of us may have a sense of something more, something greater, but it doesn't have to be romanticized. It could just be, the way a person tends to their garden, the way somebody, plays music, the way somebody listens to a friend. It's all these micro moments when we do it with our whole heart, with openness, with sincerity, that healing begins to flow in ways we might not expect. And so when we now do that in communities together, when we start actually being open to each other, like being able to invite some of those more tender aspects in a kind of slow, spacious sense, that can bring things that we don't anticipate. So I would like to say something like, the healing comes in the places and the people we might not expect, and it may be more available to us in part, in some ways, than we might perceive all the time. It might be in the sunset, right? It might be in the sound of a bird singing outside. It might come in a warm meal that's provided for somebody who made that meal for you with all their heart, and you didn't even ask for it, and it's something granted to you. And so these give us insights to this healing that's unfolding, if we can be open to them and aware and help support each other in noticing them. Right. And so there's a sense, I'll conclude by saying there's a sense in which the healing doesn't happen without our consent, but also the healing's not fully up to us to make it happen on our own terms. It's something that we yield to. It's some kind of process that I think is deep in the hearts of all reality, a greater sense of wholeness and connection, that if we're listening, we can tap into that longing together and be almost reminders to each other that there is these kinds of blossomings. So that's a little bit of what I feel in a communal sense can change things for us.
Yes. I mean, it has some practical aspects to it, and gives us a sense of, maybe think small and hope for the greater outcome. Almost like not quite, if you build it, they will come. If you try, it will happen. But in some ways, it is, you have to put your heart into it. You have to be willing to heal in order for that process to start. But back to you. You talked about culture and heritage. You talked about identity. And as someone shaped by multiple cultures and traditions, Aizaiah, and you spoke about these generational gifts and how they can help us unleash cultural and intergenerational wisdom.
Yeah,
I'd like you to say a few words about the role of cultural wisdom in collective healing, to the extent that that's possible, in a few words.
Right. I think it's absolutely essential to our collective healing is that, again, healing doesn't look like one thing, one time for one person. Even the sense of healing, for me, it's about the ways in which we are walking in a greater sense of wholeness or fullness with life. And fullness and wholeness doesn't mean that we're floating on a cloud, or that we are happy, or that, life, it kind of just feels easy. But this wholeness or this fullness is like the ways that we can be present to our lives and each other with a greater sense of connectedness, and not separating ourselves or turning ourselves away. So culturally speaking then, right, the different cultures around the world have found ways to do this in diverse ways, right? And so there's no one model of healing, and to the extent that cultural wisdom and perspectives can be offered so that we can be more present to this fullness, That's what's beautiful and amazing about our cultural wisdoms. And that's why it's also very important to preserve, to protect, to honor cultural diversity, because no one cultural perspective or wisdom or experience is going to speak to all the fullness of life. The fullness of life is beyond any one cultural experience. And so for those of us who want to live in a greater sense of fullness, then we want to cherish and appreciate the rich diversity of cultural insight, because they offer a different avenue or vista to that fullness that we do all long for in some way. And so some of the attacks on cultural groups of people or cultural wisdom or sharing, right? That's where it's very important to find ways to resist and transform some of that, because it's not just a detriment to the people that are being attacked, although they're going to be most vulnerable in a certain sense, but it's an attack on all of us, because we all lose when different aspects of our cultural diversity, our eco-diversity, our biodiversity are attacked, because we're all bound up together and because we all have something different to offer to the healing. I talked about music and art and food and, the different landscapes, right? Cultures come from attention and embodied experience in landscapes, right? I mean, cult, the kind of etymology of the word is really how we're present to the land, to the earth, to the cosmos. Mm-hmm. And so the world is vast and diverse. And so there's many different cultures that have arisen because there's many different landscapes, many different ways of land. And so how we honor those cultural insights to the experience of fullness, that helps us embrace healing in a deeper and more sustained way. And so that's where, for me, the cultural wisdom is so important. Myself being, Chinese, Malaysian, Mexican American, there's a lot of differences in those experiences, and they don't always agree with one another on what to do. And so the invitation is how to harmonize, right, some of those differences, to not erase them, but to allow them to play creatively together, to dance together, to offer things to one another, to enrich each other. And so through that process, there's actually a deepening of both cultural aspects in myself. And that's not an easy process. I would venture to say, it requires love. It requires something, again, this openness beyond to that, to be transformed. And so today in our world, the power of sharing our cultural wisdom and experience and stories with one another, I don't think can be understated. And then not just sharing and being courageous to do that, and to recognize where different power dynamics or histories make that very difficult, how to be attentive to that, but then also how to honor then what's shared, so that it's not just sharing, it's not just that sounds nice, but we actually open our heart to be changed by what we've heard, to be transformed by what's been shared, so that our perspective is enriched, our experience is deepened. And it may not even be done in some conscious way where we can articulate it, but it does change the way we live, right? It does change how we move.
That takes courage, doesn't it? It takes our willingness to, work through the fear of going through that process. Because right now, as you notice, we are living in a divided world where people are stuck in their views and look at their cultures as the primary one that they want to see protected. Sometimes at the expense of the other. How do we invite all of us to engage in this sort of, bridge building and healing, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I do think we have to be intentional. In other words, it's not just going to happen. And so there has to be a sense of intentionality that we bring. There has to be a sense of enough, we could use the word safety, but I don't know if that's the best word, but there has to be at least enough of a sense of what the hope is for this, for people to have to say yes or no, I'd like to see what happens, or not. That has to be clear. And then there has to be also a sense where people can kind of be free to engage those spaces in ways that are important for them. And so sometimes, it can be challenging to do because people feel like they're supposed to do something a certain way, or something's supposed to happen in a particular way. This happens all the time in a lot of the classes I teach or projects I lead, where people want to know, well, what's supposed to happen? How's it supposed to look? And I said, well, I don't know if we have a sense of what's exactly supposed to happen. I mean, that's what we're all here present together to find out. That takes a certain, like you said, courage and a willingness to try. and then have enough sense of agency where we can kind of step back when it gets to be too much or too intense, and that's okay too. That's all part of the journey. And so I think like having a clear intention, having a kind of start and end, kind of having ways for people to select out of it when they need to, that's all very important to honor. And then to be able to celebrate when things happen that we didn't expect, that are very powerful, that are very shaping. And so, like for me, like when I teach a class on spiritual autobiography, and again, this is one of the very important ways I think is very powerful, because we're asking a group to come together who don't really know each other to share deeply of their own experience, the questions, the challenges, to reflect on it in a very intimate, personal way. And then to the extent they're comfortable, to begin to share levels of that with others. And then, that demands a lot out of each person to do. And it also demands a lot of the group to be able to say, hey, if you're going to share this, I want to honor this in some way. I want to be able to be present to you in some way. And when you give people the invitation to do that, amazing things begin to happen. People begin to resonate and connect to an experience, a story they never thought they'd resonate with. And we realize there's so much of each other we don't know.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
That is there, that is beautiful, that's difficult, that's full. And so it's through spaces like that I think we get little tastes of what becomes possible. And then it's from tasting that now new creative action, it builds on itself. And one of the things I love about internal family systems and the insistence on kind of self-energy or self-leadership is that when self-leadership is present, it's kind of contagious. It's a way of being where now more risks are being taken, more, there might be more humor. There's a way to be more genuinely experiencing our own lives. And I think in that kind of sense, there's a new possibility to emerge. And that's the last thing I wanted to say is that when we talk about creating spaces or communities like this, the power of story, the power of reclaiming the wisdom from our cultural or spiritual histories, our lived experiences, we also have to give ourselves permission to become renewed and remade through the process. Life is a never-ending, eternal process of renewal. That's the way I see it. And so some way or another, our lives are going to be remade and renewed long after we're here, through our children, our ancestors, through the earth, through maybe some kind of sacred beings. I don't really know. But there's an ongoing eternal process of renewal and enrichment is the way I see it. And so if that's happening all the time, and really the heart of it is the celebration of fullness, that we have to give ourselves permission to be part of a renewing process, to have a new idea, to change our mind, to stop doing a certain thing, to start doing something, to make amends on a belief or something problematic maybe that served us at some point to survive. And now we go, you know what, there's a much richer way to express and experience my life. And so I think that's huge, to give people permission that, you could look different on the other side of this. In fact, you probably will. That's part of how it goes. And that gives people a sense of normalizing, the process that, wow, there is something that's changing in us. And that's part of how it will unfold. And that gives people confidence to try things out, and they don't have to be married to it forever, but to see what happens.
Well, thank you for this beautiful invitation. Now I can see your ministerial and preacher, aspects and skills coming through, Aizaiah. Thank you. We promised the listeners to give them something practical. There's a lot of insights and practical ideas that you shared already. I'm just wondering, what would be a call to action to our listeners and to me? What can we do in our spaces, be they the workplace, the household, or our neighborhoods, to honor this desire to bring, collective healing to the fore, something that we all seem to realize is much needed, maybe now even more than other times?
For me, I feel probably the strongest imperative is to find that one experience, voice, person. They could be alive in a new way, not living here in this way, but in a different way, that brings a sense of companionship to your life, brings a sense of affirmation to your life, brings a sense of being known deeply, in some deep way, and to reflect on that experience and to return to that experience as often as possible, to really know that we're not alone in this experience. We're really not alone. We all have to go through whatever it is we go through and the unique ways that we do. So no other person knows the experience you have. That's true. And yet somehow we are interconnected in this life with our human family, with the more than human family, with the sacred realities. And so whatever experience, it could be music, it could be a picture, it could be a symbol, it could be a phrase, it could be a teaching, it could be a teacher, it could be a color, it could be a memory, but something that gives us a sense of being known, being loved, just as we are, holistically, and to return to that experience, to remember it, to actually somatically, feel what it feels like to be loved. What does it taste like? What does it smell like? What does it look like? To use our memory, even our imagination, to picture that, and to allow that energy from that experience to then be the kind of grounding force that allows us to show up to whatever is happening around us. To the extent that we can bring those experiences, whatever awareness we have of them, to our own deep interiority, and to allow that to be the reservoir which nourishes us and allows us to connect. I mean, I think that changes our lives. It changes what we imagine to be possible. And it also gives us a sense that the world we long for, the communities, the societies we long for, it's already, we already know it in some way. And so we're not just making it up. We are bringing what we know in our deepest place. We're bringing that to bear in our lives in some small way. And so to the extent that we can all do that together and celebrate that together, I feel that healing starts to unfold, creativity starts to come, dance starts to come out in new ways, and all kinds of beautiful expressions. And we never know what that'll lead to, but we can feel in ourselves that sense of co-creating, co-participating in the healing that we're longed for.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much. And you kind of broaden the notion of companionship and remind all of us that we have something, not only to offer, but to connect to hold on to, whether it's a sense of inner comfort, sense of inner trust, confidence in not only in ourselves, but in our space, broadly defined. So I'm curious just to hear you share briefly a conviction, a belief, truth, a practice, a paradigm that you hold close to, that have you believe in your experience so far have been your companion.
The truth that we know, that we hope, that we love, that we are, it starts right here in our own bodies and experiences. Sometimes we feel like what it is we're looking for is somewhere else. It's in some other world, it's in some other person, it's in some other master, and we miss the very wisdom of our own life that in somehow is deeply tied and connected and woven with every other life that has been and that will be. The way that we can know it is through living our own lives, more genuinely, to not escape them. That's part of the invitation of why tending to trauma is so important, because traumatic experiences, right, they somehow prevent us to connect to some of that sometimes. And so we need then the companionship to help be present so that we regain the sense of connection in our bodies and our lives that has always been there, that I don't think can ever fully leave. There's just life circumstances that make it harder sometimes to touch into it. And so my paradigm in teaching is to recognize that the miracle of each of our lives, it has so much to reveal to us when we can learn to show up for it more genuinely and fully, and that even uniqueness has a contribution to make, not in the sense to heal or rescue or change all the problems, but as a sense to gift which each being can only gift. There's an irreplaceable sense of that. And we can only offer that in some way when we're present to it in our own lives. You know, we may give it in some kind of randomized way when we're not, but there's such a more conscious way, a kind of flowing way that our lives can offer that, that I hope and I trust in. And I see it happen in the places that people we least expect. And so to be attentive to that within each of our own lives is the invitation I'm holding and walking with, that I am looking forward to sensing and experiencing with the whole world.
So just elaborating on this a bit more and maybe taking that invitation and manifesting it out in the world, you know, if you could facilitate the emergence of one thing, quote unquote thing, in every neighborhood to help people heal together, what would that be?
A deep abiding and sense of belonging for every aspect of our experience. A deep abiding and sense of belonging for every aspect of our experience, and for every being in the world to know that. That's going to look like a lot of different things in a lot of different ways, and it's going to be expressed in countless configurations. But it's that sense of belonging, a sense of presence, a sense of support, of compassion for all that we are, that there's a place to find connection. And so experiencing that within, building communities where we're open to that possibility. For me, that's the emergence of what we are living through. And again, it's for every life. It's for nature. You know, it's for the ways that we are connected to the more than human, the way that we're connected to the spiritual beings, that they too will know that and experience that. And somehow we're able to share in that together. This kind of, the picture that my spiritual teacher, Ramon Panikar, always talks about is the banquet of life, where all beings are invited and we're feasting together. And this feast is in a sense of overcoming, and, you know, there's no drama. No, even in a banquet, there's lots of drama, at least at a good banquet.
Yes. At every banquet.
At every banquet. But there's a sense of there's a seat for everybody, and that we are learning to see what happens there. We're creating it together, we're sharing it, and we're celebrating this miraculous gift of life. That's beyond, you know, our ability to talk about it, but we can live into it together. So that's the emergence, this banquet, this celebration, that for every place, for every person, to know their invitation and to experience their life as part of that.
Well, thank you so much for this thought and for everything you shared with me today. This was a very inspiring, insightful exchange. I shouldn't call it exchange, as you know, your ability to take a complex notion and make it, I think, tractable, tangible, and, you know, hopeful. So I really want to thank you for your time. I want to congratulate you on your book, and I wish you well with it. And I want to thank our listeners for joining us. In a way, through this conversation, you really helped honor the sacred in each of us and the sacred around us, right? So if we remember that as we navigate difficult moments, where possible, because some moments are sometimes impossible to navigate, I need to acknowledge that. But that notion of the sacred in us and the sacred around us, that notion of the wisdom you referred to, that might give us sustenance, might allow us to believe that we could navigate whatever comes, is very helpful to hear. And just, I want to give you the closing word, Isaiah, and maybe the listeners, the way I do, would love to hear and learn from you. What gives you hope and resilience facing this moment?
For me, one of the greatest sources of hope is when I look into the eyes of my children and I'm able to see and experience something that's beyond words, to recognize somehow life isn't really about me at all, but there's something passing through me that I'm touching in some way that's flowing beyond whatever I could imagine, and it's that kind of, that's that energy that's flowing through me, that's my source of returning, a refuge and a reminder when things continue to go in ways how they go. So that's a great source of hope for me. Thank you for asking that.
Thank you, Aizaiah Yong. All the best.
Thanks for listening. Facing the Moment is an independent production of the Foundation for Self-Leadership, a nonprofit committed to bringing emotional, relational, and societal healing and well-being to a world in need. Learn more at foundationifs.org. You can download this and all other episodes on Apple Music, Spotify, and YouTube. Until the next episode, may we all keep facing the moment with grit and grace.